Climate change. It's pretty bad. 2021 is, especially after 2020, really the year where a lot of people are feeling the effects of climate change. Over the past 2 years, we've had huge forest fires combined with heat waves, unbelievable, massive floods, storms. I'm really not looking forward to hurricane season this year. And there's of course always the holdouts who just desperately cling to the idea of, oh no, actually these are man-made disasters not because climate change, but because of mismanagement. You know, the kinds of conservatives who went from denying climate change is even a thing straight to, well, there's nothing to be done about it now because you leftists failed to push through the necessary reform 30 years ago, so we might as well do nothing. But yeah, there's definitely an element of mismanagement to many of these catastrophes. Usually because it's neoliberal and conservative governments, having spent the last few decades slashing the budget off or otherwise sabotaging the state institutions that are supposed to manage these things. Sometimes this mismanagement has been happening for over a century, and the only reason we're really seeing the massive consequences of this is because of the increase in frequency and severity of natural catastrophes like this because of climate change. If you want more perfect storms, increasing the number of storms is a pretty reliable dial to turn. And the people who are going to suffer the most from this are, without a doubt, the poor. And I don't just mean the global poor, I mean the poor in your country, your city, and maybe even your neighborhood. Now you might be saying, what does he mean by this? Climate change is a global phenomenon. We're all fucked if we don't massively change things. And it is definitely true that, you know, we're all fucked if we don't drastically change things, but some people are going to be more fucked than others. And I'm here to explain how, because it isn't always very intuitive. In terms of the global poor, many of the poor nations around the world, one of the main reasons that they are poor is that their climate is already kind of shit. They tend to be very hot places that are already not particularly suited to grow the most nutritional crops in, and they also have a higher frequency of terrible catastrophes like droughts or terrible floodings during rain seasons occurring that can devastate entire crops, areas, economies, you have it. Most of the wealthier countries tend to have a natural climate buffer between the current catastrophic state of affairs and a truly catastrophic state of catastrophic affairs. And for most poor countries, especially those down in Africa, that buffer is a lot slimmer, so they are going to be hit first by the worst catastrophes, and in many cases already have been for even a few decades. Another factor is that rich countries, though less prone to natural catastrophes, are way better equipped to deal with natural catastrophes because they're rich. Take for instance the horrific floodings we had here in Germany these past few weeks because excessive rainfalls caused very small rivers usually to carry an immense amount of water and devastating in whole areas. Like entire villages have been destroyed, at least to a significant degree. Hundreds of people are dead, thousands of people are injured, tens of thousands of livelihoods have been destroyed when you consider the economic ripple effects that this will have throughout the affected regions. If Germany had been a developing nation and the exact same thing had happened, the consequences would have been much worse. First thing that happens is that many of these destroyed livelihoods are already being cushioned by powerful social systems. Germany has highly trained emergency service personnel in abundance. They had police, firefighters, medical staff, soldiers brought in from all over the country to help out because they all had spare capacity. They have excellent state-of-the-art equipment and the spare parts to keep that shit running for a long time. Shit, Germany has a federal agency like police and firefighters that is designed to help public institutions deal with engineering and logistics problems, who are especially experienced in dealing with floods. Some of the affected areas are difficult to reach, but the overall rescue and restoration efforts are immensely aided by the fact that Germany has a very sophisticated and stable infrastructure. There's an abundance of well-maintained, high-capacity roads that can carry heavy vehicles, railways, train lines that are still operating as though nothing had happened, fully staffed medical hospitals that have the best equipment that money can buy just outside the affected zones that have more than enough capacity to spare. The German government, both on a federal and state level, has a ton of money to spare to help with the relief efforts. Sure, it's gonna take a long time and no amount of money will bring back those who have died, but within days of this happening, the government had committed to several billion in spending to rebuild the affected areas over the course of the next few years. And shouts out to everyone donating, everyone actually down there to help out, everyone giving their support to this thing. Massive respect, my heart goes out to you, especially to my man Wesley, who has been destroying himself, working hard to keep things running down there. But the point is, developing countries have none of this. If a catastrophe on this scale happens down there, best case scenario, the international community sends 1 tent, 2 doctors, 3 nurses, and $50 in pocket change. And 40 of those $50, as well as half the medicine, is gonna have to be given to the local warlord as payment because he managed to drive out the army, because a misplaced natural catastrophe can destroy the very institutions of developing nations. They will be hit first, they will be hit the hardest, and they have the least ability to protect themselves or recover from these catastrophes. And ironically, they, as countries, are the ones least responsible for making climate change happen in the first place. Which, and I want to make this very clear, is true about the actual people in most industrialized nations also. Sure, the average person here is more responsible for it than the average person in, say, Eritrea, or one of the many countries that are being fucked, even though they didn't actually contribute to the process all that much. But even here, and especially here, really, the main culprits by a huge margin are still unbelievably powerful and gigantic megacorporations. Never forget this. Do not let the systemic issue of climate change be individualized. But even here, in the industrialized world, the poor tend to be a lot more affected by the consequences of climate change than the rich, and that's the thing that isn't particularly intuitive to most people. So when an area within a given country or even city has a higher likelihood of being affected by natural catastrophes historically, that area will tend to have cheaper real estate and therefore be inhabited by poorer people. So here, to a more limited extent, the same rule already applies if they don't have as much of a buffer. This is especially true when it comes to heat, and this is something that when I found out about it, I thought it was wild. But it's definitely very true. There's been a big data analysis situation that has been conducted in the US specifically that shows that there is a very strong correlation between heat and the average wealth of a certain county. Poorer counties are often significantly hotter than richer ones. And this applies down to almost like neighborhood levels. I'm gonna put a very interesting tool in the description where you can compare this for yourselves in your own local city. And the question is, does poverty cause heat somehow? Does heat cause poverty? And the answer to an extent is, yeah, kind of. The first factor, we already talked about this, a hotter area in a city will tend to have, less desirable real estate, so people who are poorer will have to live there as opposed to the more gentle areas. There is a historical example of this that we find especially often in European cities, where the eastern part of the city will often be poorer than the western part of the city. And the reason for this is rather simple. It's the overarching wind patterns in the northern hemisphere. When you have smokestacks from the Industrial Revolution, back when they were just blowing everything up in the air and didn't care, the wind would tend to blow it eastward a lot more frequently than westward, because that's just how winds work in Europe. And even though the smokestacks are by and large no longer there, the property values back then went down, poorer people moved in, and through the domino ripple effect and magical touch of intergenerational poverty, we can still see this pattern to this day. Now, of course, we're talking about something that is very apparent in the US, and if I have learned one thing about the United States is that when there's poverty involved, there's always like a darker dimension to it that's very uncomfortable. Many of these poor neighborhoods are predominantly black and minority neighborhoods, and they were made that way because of redlining, where they just wouldn't let brown people move into areas that were reserved for white people, which were the affluent ones. This means that for decades and centuries even, no matter how much money you had, you couldn't live in the good neighborhoods simply because you had the wrong skin color. Not that the institutionally discriminated against population descended of kidnapped slaves had a particularly huge amount of money in the first place. This then also had a ripple effect through intergenerational poverty. A big factor that people consider when they buy or even rent is this place that I'm going to live in well connected to nice and comfortable green spaces? Parks have an immense impact on property value, and poorer neighborhoods tend to not have them. If they do have them, they tend to not be the nice green ones with a lake, but just like a concrete field with maybe one box that has a wilting tree in it and a sports ball court of some description. The problem is that in terms of ecology, and therefore specifically urban planning, parks play a crucial role in regulating the temperature of an area. They are excellent regulators of what we call microclimate. They provide buffer spaces into which heat can escape and be absorbed by an active ecosystem. They improve air quality, and especially if they have a body of water of some description, they will do a lot to regulate temperature and keep it steady at a gentle and acceptable level. But parks, especially the green ones, are very expensive to build and maintain, and the poor areas in the United States and pretty much all over the world do not have the money, usually from local tax revenue, to build and maintain them, because that is how that kind of money tends to be allocated. Microclimate is such a fine-grained issue, by the way, that you can detect significant differences between one street and an adjacent street based solely on curbside greenery. You know the classic image of the big street and both sides have like houses and there's these huge trees on both sides of the road in the curbside greenery space, and they cast a nice shadow over the houses and the street. Those are great for microclimate. They help the street breathe in both a literal and figurative sense. And of course, poor areas tend to not only not have parks, but also not have properly maintained curbside greenery, because that shit is expensive and time-consuming to maintain. Local governments don't have the money, and, the governments that they find themselves inside of don't have the will to invest any money on the poor. But that is not all. The poor tend to work more physically demanding jobs that are more often outside and are thus at higher risk of heat stroke or other heat-related medical complications, which in the US can lead to some of those medical bills that'll complicate your situation even further in terms of being poor. Even at home, they're much less likely to have AC, because that shit is expensive. And you might say, oh, but that's just like 1 or 2 degrees in difference at the most, which yes, is absolutely true, but when we are talking about the negative consequences on the body of heat, 1 or 2 degrees can be the difference between life and death. And of course, as hinted at earlier already by the medical bills, there is another way in which the poor are mega fucked by climate change. The economic fallout of climate change is going to be huge. It's already pretty huge. It's just going to become unfathomably gigantic. And whenever there is economic fallout, every single time, without exception, the people who get hit first and the people who get hit the hardest are the poor. They have no way of protecting themselves from the financial disasters that will annihilate whatever meager savings they have if they've been able to build any at all, and they have no way of stopping the complete destruction of economic opportunities and potential jobs around them. And that is why any plan to fight climate change effectively must start with strong social programs and strong safety nets to protect these communities, who often tend to be minority communities who are on the front line of the consequences of the horrors of climate change, even though, once again, they are the least responsible for this shit. This is why conservatism, neoconservatism, and neoliberalism are not the systems that can effectively save the human species from climate change. Because all they're doing is easing off the gas pedal a little bit, when what we should be doing is slamming the fucking brakes and praying that the car isn't going to fly off the cliff that the guy with the spyglass, who is the scientist in this analogy, has seen coming for many years now. Problem is, person in the driver's seat is very comfortable, has AC, and really likes going fast. Sometimes I think that maybe it's time for whoever's sitting in the back or in the passenger seat to just grab control of the steering wheel and, get their foot in there, their leg. But that's a difficult topic to cut off. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or subscribe, start buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, now you know. And now you also know why people are talking about the racist element of this, because let's be honest, especially in the United States, black and minority communities are going to be first affected. This isn't to say that white poor communities aren't going to be affected, which is why it is important that a broad coalition be built. And see you around, cunts.